bombing effort. For 2 years, he's been demanding his allies launch a second front in France, taunting them for the delay. The launch of Operation Overlord, D-Day, has been long awaited. From June the 6th, 1944, Stalin finds it harder to justify his taunts. Although it is true that Anglo-American troops who fight their way ashore at Normandy will still face only half the number of German divisions Hitler has committed to the Eastern Front. But from the Normandy landings onwards, the Wehrmacht must defend the Reich against two massive armies approaching its frontiers, from the west and east. Now Zhukov initiates an ambitious plan for a massive offensive through Belorussia to the Polish border. In an unusual nod to his Georgian ancestry, Stalin names the operation Bagration, after the Georgian Napoleonic War general. The massive four-front offensive will thrust north and south of Vitebsk, with General Cherniakovsky striking towards Minsk. Rokossovsky clearing the Pripyat marshes and driving towards Warsaw. Massive troop concentrations back the planning, and Bagration is launched 3 years to the day after the Germans launched Barbarossa. This is the defining moment in the military struggle. After Bagration, the defeat of Hitler's armies will appear inevitable. The Soviet Union and its allies have more men, more tanks, and more aircraft than its foe. From Italy, France, and the Soviet borders, they press towards the Reich. Behind the German lines, almost 1 million Soviet partisans wreak havoc with supply lines and communications. They secure bridgeheads across rivers, so that regular troops can leapfrog natural obstacles before the Wehrmacht can turn them into lines of defense. Minsk, capital of Belorussia. The city has suffered the worst excesses of Nazi occupation, and now they must endure one last cataclysm as the Wehrmacht fights for every street. The city is liberated in early July. No more than a few stragglers escape from Minsk to join German formations further west. The rest are killed or captured. And the lightning Soviet advance has taken a heavy toll in German weapons and vehicles. Though the fate of Minsk itself stands as a stark reminder that the Wehrmacht still grants no easy victories. And though its common soldiers still fight with a remarkable Germanic courage and tenacity, it is now clearly an army in decline. In Moscow's Tverskaya Street, a parade like no others. 50,000 Germans on their way to work camps are displayed to their conquerors. The people watch in silence. Perhaps these vast columns of Hitler's humbled soldiery seem more human in defeat. And when, symbolically, the street is cleaned of their passing footprint, the Moscow crowds stream as silently away. While the Germans march on across Moscow's Crimea Bridge to the rail stations. And the cattle cars that will take them to work camps across the Soviet Union. Now Hitler's house of cards is crumbling. For the Führer, 1944 is indeed the year of Nemesis. Faced with almost certain rejection in his pursuit of destiny, among the ruins of Germany's capital, Hitler finally loses the last vestiges of his fragile equilibrium and sinks into madness. He refuses to recognize the seriousness of the year's military disasters. He prefers horoscopes to military advice. Despite stark evidence of impending catastrophe all around him in Berlin, he speaks only of total victory, of the 1,000-year Reich. But if one single event is responsible for pushing Adolf Hitler beyond sanity, it is the defection of the German officer class. Now, a member of one of its leading families, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, places a suitcase full of explosives in the conference hut at Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters. The bomb explodes less than 4 meters from the Führer. Certain that Adolf Hitler is dead, the plotters move quickly to seize control of Berlin. But incredibly, Hitler has survived the full force of the blast with barely visible injuries. He's filmed at the hospital, visiting others from the conference room who were less lucky. Proof to the German people of his extraordinary survival. Proof in his mind that he is still destiny's instrument. But he takes a savage revenge. Hundreds of suspects are arrested and tortured by the Gestapo. The trials, presided over by the notoriously rabid judge of the People's Court, Roland Freisler, are exercises in the propaganda of humiliation. Before the court are some of the most highly respected figures in non-Nazi society, Junkers. Men like Adam Trott-zu-Zoltz and Count von Schulenburg, the ambassador who had in other days overseen the Soviet-German pact. Defendant after defendant is subjected to hysterical denunciation and then sentenced to death. Hitler watches film of their executions. Some are shot, others are guillotined or hung on meat hooks, strangled with piano wire. The funeral of Field Marshal Rommel, the most senior officer implicated in the plot, is conducted with all the pomp and ceremony of the Third Reich. He has been offered the choice between a certain death sentence and a state funeral with his wife left unharmed if he chooses suicide. He has chosen to take the poison provided by the Führer's emissaries. From the Kremlin, there is silence on the whole incident. No dictator views an assassination attempt, even on an enemy dictator, with total equanimity. Now, gathering momentum with the success of Bagration, the Red Army drives across the old borders of the Soviet Union into Romania. Into Bulgaria, into Yugoslavia, liberating Belgrade alongside Tito's independent partisan army. Professor Semiriaga.
Балкан всегда был очень лакомым куском для великих держав Европы.
The Balkan region had always been an important region for the great powers of Europe. It had always been an object of political and economic interest to these countries. So, of course, it's no surprise that before the Second World War, the Balkans preserved its importance for the warring factions as much for the Allies as for the Axis coalition. It's well known that the British leader Churchill openly expressed the opinion that he would prefer the Second Front to be opened up in the Balkans.
But Poland, as it has always been for Stalin, is the prize. For the Polish people, Hitler's war has been an unrelieved nightmare. Penned in behind the wall of the notorious Warsaw Ghetto, Poland's Jewish population has been the victim of some of Nazis' ideology's most appalling racial experiments, target for its notions of ethnic cleansing. After years of a tenuous existence inside the ghetto, survivors rose against Hitler's extermination program in 1943. But after a month's fighting, the uprising was crushed by the SS with the utmost brutality, and the ghetto cleared. By the time the Red Army enters Poland in the summer of 1944, only a few dozen Jews remain in hiding in the capital. And it is not only Poland's Jews who suffer. Occupied and partitioned in 1939, Poland as an entity ceased to exist. On its territory, Germany has established most of the notorious extermination camps where Europe's Jews, gypsies, Russian prisoners are being efficiently gassed and burnt. Its national life continues only in its underground army and those forces fighting under the command of its exile government in London. Majdanek, eastern Poland, late July 1944. The first of the death camps is liberated, almost still operating, by the Red Army. The full extent of Hitler's genocidal madness is now revealed to the world, and there is worse to come as the Red Army goes on to liberate Sobibor, Treblinka, and, most terrible of all, the great killing complex at Auschwitz. A reconnaissance paratrooper when she was captured behind German lines, Irina Kharina has survived in Auschwitz since April 1943. Exposed to all its unique horrors, she remembers one moment above all others.
Opposite us was hut number 11. French women were being held there. Then one night, a lorry drove up and every single one of them was forced into it and brought to the crematorium. They knew that they were going to die. They knew where they were being taken to. And these doomed women were only a few hours from death, sang the Marseillaise. They sang it loudly for the whole camp to hear, and we, locked up in our hut, could only cry. It is something I will remember forever.
As Soviet forces approached the camp, she and two friends were in the last column of Russian prisoners the SS marched westwards.
One night we decided to hide in a pile of hay in the barn. In the morning, the other girls in our group began to call for us loudly by name. And that was extremely frightening, because that might have alerted the Germans to the fact that we were hiding somewhere. Another terrifying moment was when the SS soldiers came into the barn with guard dogs. To us, the sound of their machine guns finishing off exhausted stragglers was as nothing in comparison to the sound of those dogs barking in that barn. It was only years later that I discovered the dogs can't sniff people out when they're hiding in hay. But that moment was the most frightening of my life. So we waited till dark, left the barn, and set off to look for refuge in a peasant's house.
Rescued by Soviet troops, she finds, to her horror, she is immediately taken by the NKVD back to Auschwitz, now being used as an interrogation center.
We were interrogated about all that had happened to us, and the interrogations were very thorough, because they even wanted to know what had specifically happened on a specific day. But I have to say that Auschwitz had been full of all sorts of people. For example, there had been some girls in Auschwitz who had collaborated with the Germans and had even betrayed us to the Gestapo when we had first arrived in Smolensk. So I think it was quite right that we were all interrogated, but it didn't have to be quite so thorough. It was very harrowing being interrogated every night, and the questions were always the same. When did this happen, and when did that happen? What helped us a lot was the fact that there were 3 of us, and our evidence all coincided. So we didn't have to make anything up, because every single word of our evidence was the same. But all the same, I just couldn't believe it when the final interrogator told me I was free to resume my studies at college. I was convinced something else was going to befall me. And they did actually set us free, although they didn't give us any money or clothes for our journey. And finally, in September 1945, we got home, having hitched all the way there on goods trains.
As the advancing Soviet army clears the Germans from Poland's cities, the first massacres of political prisoners are discovered. In this city, only 6 prisoners succeeded in hiding when the rest are shot down by their retreating guards. But it is in the devastated city of Lublin that the most horrific prison massacre is found. The great castle at Lublin has housed prisoners throughout the German occupation. Now, as the Red Army enters the ruined city and Soviet units are welcomed on the streets, infantrymen break into the castle prison. In the prison tailoring room, over 600 have been shot down. The large proportion of women suggests they were machine-gunned while at work. In the courtyard, many more. Hitler as murderer, Stalin as liberator. It has been a familiar script, and one that helps conceal Stalin's own crimes against the Polish people. Crimes like the killing of 20,000 Polish army officers in 1940, a massacre for which the Soviet dictator and the Soviet system have gone to great lengths to escape widespread blame. When in 1943, German authorities discovered and exposed over 4,000 officers' graves at Katyn forest near Smolensk, there were few in the West who believed their claim that the NKVD was responsible. The Western Allies, faced with Stalin's angry denials, accepted Soviet assertions of Nazi guilt. Despite the strength of filmed German evidence, and despite horrified protests from the anti-communist Polish government exiled in London, Stalin will never admit responsibility for Katyn. After the war, he will hide behind the USSR's own film of the bodies made in 1947. By then, the world will know the true Joseph Stalin, and few will doubt his guilt. But in the early summer of 1944, he can still wear the guise of Poland's and Eastern Europe's great liberator. The first overt signal that Stalin comes not as liberator but as conqueror is seen in late July, as General Rokossovsky takes the eastern Polish city of Lublin. Within hours of the red flag's appearance over the city, Stalin has installed a puppet communist government, the Lublin Committee. They are invited to Moscow, where they are met by Wyszynski. Loud denunciations by nationalist Poles in London bring little response from the Allied corridors of power, and the London Polish government is powerless to prevent this theft of its constituency. But its cries will not long go unheeded. Uncle Joe Stalin is about to drop his mask and show his true face to the world. The Red Army is approaching Warsaw now, the very heart of suffering in the Second World War. On the 29th of July, Soviet radio issues a general plea to the Polish resistance movement, the Home Army. The carefully worded broadcast calls for active resistance to the occupying forces and gives the impression, without ever directly saying so, that the Red Army is about to storm the city. The Home Army, though gathered for a rural campaign, answers what it sees as a clarion call from its ally in full measure. And on the 1st of August, battle erupts once more on the streets of Warsaw. At first, the rising takes the German garrison by surprise, and the insurgents seize large parts of the city. But they need help before German reinforcements arrive. Surely the Red Army can attack now, or at least send much-needed weapons and supplies. But the Red Army does not move from its positions just east of the city, and Stalin, oblivious to mounting pressure from Western leaders, grimly rejects Churchill's request for the use of Soviet airfields for RAF planes dropping supplies. Without help, the Poles are doomed. SS units under General Bakselewski are dispatched to Warsaw to put down the rising. Hopelessly outgunned, the Home Army fights for every building, clings to every strong point, vainly awaiting salvation from the east. The battle for the city rages all through August and into September. But gradually, inevitably, the Polish resistance movement is decimated.
Была причина в том, что Сталин сказал, что он не хочет иметь ничего общего с этой Варшавской войной.
It was out of political considerations that Stalin did not want to help the uprising. It was an uprising which was obviously in conflict with the interests of the Soviet Union and the so-called Lublin Committee of National Salvation. But purely from a military point of view, the Warsaw insurgents were heroically and courageously fighting the Germans for the freedom of their homeland. So in this sense, they were not our enemies, but our allies. However, from the political point of view, unfortunately, everything was the wrong way round. But still, something could have been done if Stalin had only had the political will to do so.
Stalin bows to international criticism only in September, when an increase in Soviet aid comes too late. The last Home Army survivors surrender in early October. By the time the Red Army finally occupies Warsaw's ruins in January 1945, 300,000 Poles have died in the city since August. If Stalin's purpose has been to engineer the destruction of nationalist armed force in Poland, it has succeeded completely. But events in Warsaw have set in motion a transformation of British and American attitudes towards their ally. From now on, they will scrutinize Stalin's motives with new suspicion. From now on, Stalin must fight yet another war, this time a secret, silent battle against his own allies. It is a battle quickly joined on both sides. British Prime Minister Churchill visits Moscow in October, and he has come to discuss the fate of Eastern Europe. Churchill is already deeply suspicious of Stalin's post-war intentions, but he is a realist too. And he knows that there is little that Britain or even the United States can do to stop a man whose ambitions are backed by Red Army occupation.
Churchill's position was a most paradoxical one. As one of the Allied leaders, he had won. He was a winner, but a winner with a disintegrating empire. And as a serious and far-sighted politician, he knew this.
And so the two leaders reach a pragmatic agreement. Jotted down on a piece of scrap paper, it concedes Soviet control over Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania in return for Stalin's guarantee of non-intervention in Greek politics. The future of Yugoslavia is left open, and Stalin refuses even to discuss Poland. But the Polish question, on which Britain went to war in 1939, will not go away. And it dominates the next round of Stalin's secret struggle against his allies at Yalta in the Crimea in February 1945. At Yalta, Stalin meets Roosevelt for the last time. Sick man, close to death, the American president is determined to recruit Stalin to the war against Japan and dismisses Churchill's fear of Soviet expansionism. Deliberately marginalizing the British leader, Stalin promises to fight Japan after Germany is beaten and is again able to deflect all attempts to solve the Polish problem. While the conference proceeds to drafting a joint demand for Germany's unconditional surrender, the rest of Eastern Europe is hardly even discussed. Now, as Stalin takes his leave of Allied leaders, his smile is the smile of the tiger. And as head of state, Kalinin pins on Stalin a self-awarded medal. It is accompanied by a letter begging for his wife's release. But she remains at forced labor. Soviet troops are now firmly in place in several European states beyond the Soviet border, in Romania, Bulgaria, and, most importantly, in Poland. These are prizes Joseph Stalin will not forego. and there seems now little doubt that his allies, through impotence or indifference, will allow him freedom to take whatever he chooses. The Thousand-Year Reich, Hitler's dark vision. A rapacious empire built on pomp and pageant, and on war. Now the vision is evaporating. Germany is on its knees. And retribution is at hand. As 1945 dawns, the sky is literally falling in on the people of Germany. Massive fleets of British and American heavy bombers pound cities, factories, and oil refineries to rubble. Sudden death has become a way of life in Germany. The Nazi edifice is crumbling. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, is all but powerless to interfere. Outnumbered 6-1, it is short of modern aircraft, pilots, ammunition. Above all, it desperately lacks fuel. Yet final defeat will not come from the skies, but over land. Germany is surrounded. From every frontier, enemies are marching on the heart of the fatherland. In the west, Allied armies cut deep into Germany during the first months of 1945. They have twice as many men as the Wehrmacht, 4 times as many tanks. And they are infinitely better supplied. But Hitler is sending his last reserves east in a desperate attempt to stave off an even more deadly foe. The Red Army, already sweeping through Eastern Europe. By mid-March, the Red Army has seized most of the Baltic coast. And it has smashed its way through Nazi-occupied Poland. Wehrmacht troops, loyal for so long, are surrendering in their thousands. As Soviet forces press hard against the German frontier. A sign marks the spot. This is accursed Germany. The scene is set for one last great Soviet drive west, to Berlin. As the Red Army storms towards the capital, it liberates Soviet citizens captured by the Nazis for slave labor. And it frees surviving victims of the concentration camps. The experience leaves Stalin's troops hungry for revenge. They've reconquered lands blighted by Hitler's wildest experiments in genocide. They've been to Auschwitz, where millions of mutilated corpses cry silently for vengeance. Hatred of the Reich needs little encouragement at the front. Hitler knows he is surrounded. As giant pincers close around him, he orders the defense of Berlin to the last German. Old men, women and children prepare for a desperate fight against hopeless odds. Yet at the same time, Hitler orders a scorched earth policy, the destruction of mines, power stations, water supplies, anything that might sustain life for survivors. It is his final betrayal of the German people, a people who remain astonishingly loyal in the face of certain defeat. In his madness, Hitler believes that they have failed his vision. This is his revenge for what he calls their treachery. Though even now they are willing to die for him, boys of the Hitler Youth ready themselves for battle. Innocents devoured by evil. Ordinary people still cheer Hitler's armies, but what else can they do? These troops are all that stand between Germany and Armageddon. By late March, the Western Allies are across the Rhine, and beyond that great natural barrier, Germany lies almost undefended. As the German army's will to fight at last begins to slip away, soldiers and civilians flee west. Better by far to seek mercy from the British and Americans than at the hands of Stalin's avengers. Goebbels' propaganda has shown them what to expect from Stalin. They know that the Red Army is seeking vengeance for Hitler's atrocities in the East. But even in the West, British and Americans exact full retribution for SS crimes. Allied troops escort a prisoner who is informed against camp guards. His identity is concealed. Fear of the Nazis will not die overnight. Yet even now, the Führer is juggling improbable strategies for victory. He refuses to believe that his country lies in mortal peril. Insanely, he is convinced that massive counteroffensives in the East can still bring victory. But the armies to carry them out exist only in his imagination. And the Red Army is coming to shatter his illusions. Its great assault on Berlin is about to begin. Marshal Zhukov, never defeated in battle, will command Soviet forces. He is the Soviet Union's greatest military hero.
He was the only one who could talk to Stalin without constraints. If Stalin was not right, say about some military issue or whatever, he was the only one who could discuss it with him or argue with him.
At the beginning of April, Stalin and Zhukov meet in Moscow, preparing the final blow against Hitler.
I was there when they were walking in the Kremlin. Stalin used to keep a step behind, and he put his arm round Zhukov and he said to him, "You are my Suvorov, the great general who defeated Napoleon and never lost a battle."
But Stalin's paranoia and his mistrust of generals means that Zhukov can enter the Kremlin a marshal and leave moments later under arrest. And Zhukov is a prime candidate for such treatment. His uncompromising character and hints of independence have been known to prompt displeasure, even rage, in Stalin. The dictator knows that in this, the Soviet Union's vital hour of decision, he must have his most brilliant commander at his side. Nevertheless, as Zhukov prepares to take Berlin, NKVD agents are watching him.
Abakumov, Beria, Kobolov,
and Merkulov started to collect evidence against Zhukov after Hakim Gol. They tried even harder after he became commander of Kiev military region and then head of general headquarters. They started filling the dossier against him at exactly that time. They followed everyone, and any little incident, however minor, was added to the file.
But Stalin's secret files are for later. Zhukov is safe for now, at least until Germany is beaten. The night of the 15th of April. 22,000 heavy guns announced the Red Army's offensive east of the German capital. Stalin claims he has 6 million men against less than 1 million armed remnants of every unit the Reich can muster. In the south, Konyev's first Ukrainian front breaks through at once to sweep round Berlin. In the north, Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front overcomes difficult terrain to take Mecklenburg. And in the center, Zhukov's great host grinds inexorably west towards a ruined Berlin still reeling under incessant air attack. On the 19th of April, Soviet troops reach the Berlin suburbs. Now it is street fighting, house by house, everyone a natural redoubt for desperate defenders. Casualties mount. Resistance stiffens, but the Soviet armies cannot be halted now. Hitler's Reich has been pierced to the heart. The apartments of high-ranking Nazi officials, now lying directly in the path of Stalin's vengeful armies, are shaken by the battle. Those who have prospered by Hitler's promises face the collapse of all they have believed in. Yet Hitler still lives. Prowling the bunker, he gloats over his photograph albums, celebrations of past glories. While his people pay the price of defeat, he celebrates the death of Roosevelt as a portent of victory. And imagines the imminent outbreak of war between the Allies. On the 25th of April, southern units of Konyev's front make contact with United States forces at the Elbe. No hint of future tensions here. With these happy scenes, Hitler's last fantasy evaporates. Commanders with Konyev's and Patton's armies hold a banquet to celebrate their momentous meeting. Steak and a special victory cake are on the menu, washed down with champagne and followed by toasts. Whiskey meets vodka. Now, as Soviet forces converge on the center of Berlin, the fighting embraces everything and everyone in the battle zone. But even now, Hitler has one guardian angel, fighter pilot Hannah Reich. The only woman to receive an Iron Cross in the Second World War, she is utterly devoted to the Führer. On the 29th of April, she pilots her light aircraft into the heart of Berlin. Touching down on the Unter den Linden, she makes the perilous journey through the mayhem of battle to Hitler's bunker, where he waits the end, comforted by a few treasured possessions. Pictures of himself, reminders of better days, and his family tree. Hannah Reich is Hitler's last chance to escape. But he will not leave. Preferring to cling to the past, he chooses to meet his destiny in Berlin. Next day, the last day of April, the Führer marries Eva Braun. She will share his chosen fate. But for the defenders in the streets, there is only one choice left to make, between surrender and death. Many are giving up the fight, but pockets of fanatical resistance remain. And in this final battle for Berlin, so close to the end, many on both sides will be struck down, and tens of thousands will die. General Ustugov commanded a Red Army battalion through the battle.
We launched the Oder Berlin offensive on April 16th and ruptured the enemy defense. I cannot remember eating or sleeping, but I remember every detail of the combat operations. Everybody does, because it was one of the final battles and because we paid dearly for it. In the 2nd Battalion, only 2 soldiers survived, and no one from the 3rd. All the reinforcements were youngsters who had grown up in occupation, kids who had been taken by force over here and had grown up in German territory. Field recruiting officers drafted them and sent them straight to us, untrained. And that's what I remember, them lined up, our last formation. The battalion had no more than 70 people, including the liberated prisoners of war. They were easy to spot as they didn't have full uniforms. They might have a cap and tunics with civilian trousers or the other way round. They couldn't fight in their prison clothes, and there were youngsters who were only 15 or 16 when they were sent. In 1944 we started drafting at 17, and they rarely had uniforms. They were trained there and then how to load automatic rifles, how to throw a grenade. Can you imagine what price we had to pay for those final battles?
And the struggle for the last citadel of German government, for the Reichstag itself, claims many more young lives. SS units defend the Reichstag to the last man. But on the 30th of April, Soviet troops charge up the steps and burst into the building. At last, the red flag flies over Berlin, and the death of Nazi Germany is just a breath away. Hitler is truly vanquished.
What did the raising of the flag at the Reichstag mean? It was a symbol of victory, the end of the war and the start of a new life.
Only the last act remains. Somewhere, cowering in the ruins of Germany, are Nazi leaders whose fanaticism has terrorized Europe and the world. But defeat is more than they can bear. The charred remains of Goebbels. His wife Magda is also dead. Before killing themselves, they order the family doctor to poison their 6 children. Himmler, a British prisoner, chooses suicide. For many other Nazis, and for their families, the end of the Reich means the end of everything. An epidemic of suicide sweeps Germany. For those Nazi leaders still alive, incarceration. Goering hands himself over to the Americans. Keitel, Dönitz, Speer, and of course Hess, all prisoners. But where is Adolf Hitler? Mikhail Poselsky receives news that Hitler's body has been found at the Chancellery.
We entered the hall on the ground floor. It was a large conference room, and in the center was a body covered by what looked like a grey soldier's blanket. A general ordered the soldiers to lift the blanket, and there was a middle-aged man who looked a lot like Hitler. He had a moustache, and the parting in his hair was on the right-hand side, which was not common, and a forelock covering his forehead. He also had a corporal's award in his buttonhole. At the bridge of his nose, just below his forehead, was an incoming bullet hole, so the nose had shifted and was swollen. You can see it on the photograph, and of course this distorted his features. The chief pathologist of the First Belarusian Front was called in. He was a colonel. He asked for a profile shot of Hitler, which was easy to find in the Reich Chancellery. And he held it up to the dead man's face and started to compare the ears. I didn't know this, but he explained that ears were like fingerprints. No two people have an identical pair of ears, and so he couldn't conclusively determine if this was Hitler or not. His verdict: the body was not Hitler. After that, they completely removed the blanket, and we saw the whole body. We noticed that his socks were darned in several places. This helped prove that it was not him, as Hitler was unlikely to wear darned socks. Hitler had a butler who looked a lot like him, moustache, everything. Even Hitler said to him, "Shave off your moustache, or people might confuse us one day."
But Hitler's remains are found by Soviet troops in Berlin. He has poisoned Eva Braun and then shot himself, leaving orders for their bodies to be burnt in the bunker garden. Stalin is informed of the discovery by Zhukov, but refuses to believe it. He insists that Hannah Reich could have saved the Führer. And he sends Beria to Berlin to investigate events during the bunker's last hours. The Red Army is still fighting in Czechoslovakia. But for troops in Berlin, this is a time to honor 300,000 comrades lost in the battle. Yet it is also a time for celebration and for relaxation after the grim privations of their trek across Eastern Europe. They have a chance to rest now, but they are a long way from home. And for most, there will be no swift return. There will be armies of occupation in Berlin for many years to come. Germans still alive in Berlin face an existence without hope. The German tradition of law and order cracks. They face starvation and homelessness. Forced to loot and fight for survival, drunkenness is a release from crushing defeat, a defeat which brings the horror of rape to thousands of German women. Berlin stands at a crossroads. Its citizens, old and new, can only guess which way the future lies.
What am I? I'm just an ordinary country girl. I did my 10 years at school, and then when the war started, I went to the front. I made my way through the Ukraine, Crimea, and then up to Berlin.
Germany's fate lies in the hands of the world's new leaders. The Reich's representatives, now powerless, must bow to their conquerors and perform their final function, unconditional surrender. The ceremonial signing takes place in Berlin's eastern suburb. Zhukov leads the Allied representatives, followed by Tedder, Eisenhower's British deputy. Just after midnight on the 9th of May, German capitulation is formalized. Keitel signs for Germany. Grim-faced, resigned, he will later be hanged for his crimes. Victory in Europe, sealed at last. At a festive banquet, the generals salute their triumph, and Zhukov dances Russkaya, though the cameras are sent outside. For the Red Army and for the Soviet people, festival time.